Hello. Hello, everyone. Give everybody just a sec here to join. All right. Hello. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Glossy's weekly beauty debrief here on LinkedIn. I'm Lexi Lebsack, West Coast correspondent here at Glossy, and I'm here with several members of our team for an exciting topic today. We've got Tatiana Pyle, our managing editor here at Glossy, Courtney Marabella, Glossy social media and audience manager, Jill Manoff, our wonderful editor-in-chief, and Zofia Skyglinska, Glossy's international fashion reporter. And Zofia, we're so excited to have you here. I know you mostly cover fashion stuff, but you're reporting on sustainability and this whole side of the industry, I think is going to give us, some really great insights today. Welcome everyone to our event. Today we're going to be doing things a little bit differently from our usual format, and that's because it is Earth Month. And we really want to take some time to share some practical insights on the state of sustainability, the things that we've learned through our reporting over the last few months, because of course, as we know, state sustainability, along with the science that fuels it, is really a moving goalpost. And so we want to share some new things, some new insights, and other things that we think are valuable for brands and marketers and retailers as we enter Earth Month, which has a very long lead up to Earth Day on April 22nd. How's everyone doing today?
I'm good. Thanks, Lexi. Excited to talk sustainability. And excited to have Zofia joining us. As you said, she's such the expert, so we can go deep.
Yeah. So listeners, please stay tuned, and we'll be asking for questions very soon. I would love for this to be a conversation. If you have any questions, comments, please raise your hand and we'll bring you up to chat. So I want to just sort of start us off with a really brief history of this month, which I found to be kind of interesting. I think a lot of the times when you are, or when we're dealing with sort of like a holiday or a month or something like that sort of revolves around special interests, it tends to have, very different beginnings. And this one really is very grassroots. So really quick, in 1969, the U.S. had just basically watched this really terrible oil spill happen in Santa Barbara. And two conservation-minded legislators were really inspired by what was happening on college campuses around the anti-war movement. And they thought, what if we can do these campus teach-ins with a goal, of course, to scale the idea to the broader public and talk about environmentalism, talk about, how we can improve knowledge around what's going on in the environment. So they selected a day, April 22nd, which is literally just a weekday that sort of fell between spring break and final exams. And so they were hoping to maximize the greatest student participation. As one does, they brought in so they brought in other organizations to start, faith groups, other sort of special interest groups. They named it Earth Day, and in 1970, they basically created the very first Earth Day, thanks to a young activist named Dennis Hayes, who really helped to organize this. And it started out with a huge bang, and I really think that's why it is what it is today. So basically 20 million Americans on Earth Day in 1970, they took to the streets, they took to parks, auditoriums to really demonstrate against things that were impacting the earth. So at that point, it was like oil spills, pollution, stuff like that. And it became, what we have today. And 50 years later, we're still seeing a lot of really positive things come from Earth Day and a lot of real grassroots organization. But however, I really want to ask my Glossy colleagues here today. It feels like, for me, the sentiment around Earth Day, especially as we're talking about for-profit companies like brands and retailers, that it really has, given consumers this sense of skepticism. And I think that's kind of like really what we're working through today. How can brands, be more authentic? But curious, Zofia, Tatiana, Jill, what do you guys think about that? Do you guys feel that consumers are very skeptical right now?
Tatiana, do you want to go first, or should I? I think that...
Oh, go ahead, Zofia. You can go. I think that the consumers right now are still very skeptical because they have seen that, brands don't necessarily make the truest of claims, and I think it really kind of affects their perception of, should I be trusting this if this is written on a label? Like, is this something that I should be aware of? The whole kind of impact around clean beauty and the various vague definitions around that, I think have really kind of led to a public mistrust of like what sustainability should look like in terms of like marketing language.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, especially in regards to clean beauty. A lot of it is not technically regulated, so anyone can slap clean beauty on a label, but what does it actually mean? What is clean about it? What is sustainable about it, or eco-friendly? So I think now in a time when consumers are, become feeling more empowered to learn more and have more access to resources and information, it begs the question, kind of like what Sophia said, what actually here is sustainable and what does sustainability really look like in terms of making a real impact on reducing some of the waste and some of that carbon neutral initiatives that companies are kind of working toward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that this is really where it's most important for brands and retailers to kind of think about the greenwashing. So, I'm sure everyone listening knows what greenwashing is. It's, commonly refers to marketing that misleads consumers about a brand's products, services, favorable impact on the environment. So oftentimes, I know this comes from marketing, from packaging. I see a lot of greenwashing in a lot of parts of the beauty industry. I think that some of the worst is around packaging, as well as sort of like ingredients and sourcing. What do you guys, Tatiana, Sophia, Joe, what do you guys think are sort of like the worst culprits in terms of greenwashing right now that brands should be aware of?
I think for me, it's mostly like the language that you use and the visuals, because both of those have such a big impact on consumer purchase decisions. If you're writing that something is clean or natural or like organic, or I don't know, like it has some kind of a label to suggest that it's kind of more pure than something else. And if it's, played out on like, I don't know, like what I think it's what you said, Tatiana, last week around the packaging being kind of like brown or neutral and like not really being anything that you'd see unless it was a sustainable brand. So I think having that, or like green backgrounds, lush fields, I think that's the one that I always end up seeing.
Yeah, I think that one's a big one. I once reported years ago about this company that had come out with what I thought was a really great initiative, and they were sort of had weird timing with it because they wanted to use ocean-bound plastic, but they also, weren't certain if the consumer was necessarily wanting that, but they wanted to do something and make it really splashy. So they used like a very small percentage of ocean-bound plastic and they sandwiched it between layers of virgin plastic, and then they colored the package dark gray to sort of make it seem like they were using recycled plastic, because recycled plastic tends to, not be like that bright white color. And they really got sort of torn apart, and the initiative did not do well. And I think that we still see that happening, though. And Sophia, that's a great point about, using that subliminal advertising marketing to, put flowers and plants and green, when in reality, they're not necessarily backing up what they're talking about here, or what they're leading the consumer to believe. Sophia, I know we've been talking a lot on Glossy and your reporting and all of our reporting about the greenwashing ban that's happening in the EU, and also some other legislation that's sort of coming down from California. Can you walk us through sort of what's happening in the EU around greenwashing?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, so in terms of greenwashing, there's kind of two main areas that's happening in both the UK and the EU. So in the EU, on January 17th, the European Parliament basically approved some new legislation aimed at curbing greenwashing, and it specifically kind of focuses on consumer product categories. So I think it's got a very long name. It's called like the Directive on Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition. And it will ban basically like unfounded claims anything in terms of carbon neutral claims. And while I don't think it's meant to go into effect immediately, I think it's going to take up to 2 years before it goes into effect. It basically shows where, at least from the EU perspective, where that's going. And it's quite interesting because it's actually a little bit slower than what's happening in the UK. In the UK, you've actually already got a couple of companies which have been called on by I can't remember what it's called. I think it's the UK Competition and Markets Authority, which is basically like a UK watchdog. And recently it's been really focused on greenwashing. So in December, it is basically calling out and has put Unilever, who own a lot of beauty brands, under investigation. And so that is basically one of the biggest areas that it's focusing on, is that greenwashing aspect. It said that, some of the statements and the kind of language that Unilever uses in its brands is vague and kind of broad. So suggesting, again, that there's not like a precision of information. And also that they've exaggerated how natural the product is. So I think it's a lot of that. I'm not sure if it's all that different from what is going to be happening in the US, because I think there is going to be more greenwashing legislation coming in there. But it definitely feels like the action's kind of ramped up. And on the fashion side, there's already been, some kind of investigations happening from the UK side, at least, into fashion brands. But on the beauty side, it's still a little bit early. I think Unilever's kind of the biggest fish that they've put under investigation so far.
I think this is really interesting, and I think the reason why we found it so crucial to be reporting on is because we're kind of living in a global world now. So it's you can have special marketing or special packaging or whatever for the UK or the EU or for California, but it doesn't really work like that anymore. It's once you put one thing out on Instagram, on your website, or create something for a global retailer, you really do have to be in compliance globally. Would you say that you agree with that? That's sort of one of the biggest issues that brands need to be aware of, Sophia?
Yeah, I think so. Just because previously there was always that segmentation of the market. You could do one thing here, and obviously that reduced costs somewhat because of the fact that, you didn't have to pay for maybe auditing or for specific maybe regulation, certification. Whereas now, if you're doing it and, you are selling products globally, you have to make sure that you're legislating and kind of making sure that you're under that legislation or, certificates, whatever you have, under every single country. And those things can differ a lot. I think this is somewhat of the issue with some of the EU regulation, is that a lot of it can actually seem a little bit vague in itself, that it's not quite clear what a retailer should do or a brand should do. And that's why it's kind of better to err on the side of caution and make sure that you're not, promoting any of that, at least through marketing, because obviously product development, packaging, all of those things take a little bit longer to implement, but marketing is something that you can literally do, as soon as that is an issue. Those campaigns that you're working on, the social media posts that you're working on, all of those things can, effectively get changed.
That's such a great point, that marketing really is that thing that you should be focusing on in the immediate. And taking us to sort of our next point, I really want to talk a little bit about some actual changes that brands can make in their marketing as we enter Earth Month. I know we all probably have those words that kind of irk us that brands use. In Glossy reporting from February, we spoke to experts in the greenwashing legislation arena and found that certain terms should be used very, very carefully. And that includes things like biodegradable, climate neutral, eco-friendly, green, and one that I see a lot, which is good for the planet, which, I think that if it is a vague thing and also a bold thing, it's maybe not so easy to get away with. And maybe brands should sort of steer away from those terms in specific. Healthy, all natural, organic are also big ones. Of course, we don't have the kind of regulation that we will have in a few years as things sort of start to change. But we still do have the FTC, and they have dealt with false beauty claims in the past. So there is one case I would just call out, which is that Truly Organic. They were a beauty brand. They're still a beauty brand, but they were a beauty brand that made some 100% organic and certified organic. And I believe even made some vegan claims that ended up not being totally accurate. And they had to pay almost $2 million in a settlement. And then they had to change their name to Truly Beauty, which I think is just, one example of how, while we do want to do right by consumers, there's also this other side of things that's also, around. But curious, people on this call, and as well as Glossy colleagues here, what are the words, what are the phrases that irk you when you see them on packaging and you sort of say like, oh, that's greenwashing?
All that you mentioned. And also, I think increasingly it's not about environmentally friendly, but it's the same conversation that we're having around clean with clean beauty. Like, what does that mean? Define it. Emma Sandler on our team recently did a story about clinical trials and the rise of that, and really justifying your claims and putting that front and center, which is becoming more important. But anything, like you said, that is vague, it is with nothing to back it up, or you have to really do work to dig in and find the facts, that's irking to me.
That's a great call. I would also say that I spoke to an attorney, Allison Stevenson, Esquire, and she gave some advice in a Glossy story that we published in February that we can also link here for everyone to take a look at. And she said that healthy and all natural are sort of the ones that she sees brands having the most trouble with. But she also sort of suggests on pulling back on basically any buzzwords that don't sort of have very specific, proof. So anytime you throw in what she calls a qualifier, those tend to really get people into trouble. So if you're curious what you think about this. Oh, Sophia, if you're talking, we can't hear you. And if anyone has any questions, comments, or any of those sort of words or buzzwords that sort of irk you around greenwashing, please raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you.
Alexia, I sort of chuckled a bit when you mentioned good for the earth or good for the planet, because I see that on so many brands' sites. And I'm like, the moment that a brand takes its product to manufacturing, is no longer good for the environment. If it's being mass produced, it's not good for the environment. So I feel like it's such a hypocritical term to use, but you see it everywhere because, like you said, it's a buzzword and it's a marketing jargon that people use to get consumers really intrigued and wanting to buy this product. But like we've all kind of concluded here, when you do the further research and digging, it's like, what does this actually even mean, really?
Yeah, 100%. I feel like you're totally right. I think that's a really hard lesson for marketers and beauty brands to really understand, is that it's so true. If you are creating a product and putting a product out into the world, it can't be good for the planet. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, what you're doing is awful. We're all using products and there's proper ways to dispose of products, but it's we know it's not good for the planet.
Yeah.
It can also, another conversation that's related that is also interesting and something that brands are telling me they struggle with is communicating in what ways they are organic or clean or sustainable, what have you, in a way that's digestible by the audience and the consumer, where they're not going to just glaze over or keep scrolling because there's too much information. So you could see, Lexi, you mentioned a brand with the name organic in the title or in the name. There's also Love Beauty Planet. That really, really communicates what you're trying to say here. We're good for the planet. I'm not sure to what extent that's true. Maybe it is. But, putting something so bold, listing something so bold makes a lot of sense, and yet it's dangerous territory. Like, what's the balance there?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think, sorry guys, I had to rejoin, but in terms of what's overcomplicated versus like oversimplifying things, I think that it's probably a good thing to learn from some of the fashion brands who have been doing this for a long time. So I know that I talked to a brand today who have had to kind of basically figure out what's like a one measure thing that makes sure that, you know, whatever they're saying is accurate. So they've decided on carbon emissions. And while that might not be the best, I think, like category signifier in beauty versus fashion, because obviously carbon's just a bigger thing for fashion, I think, than beauty, because you've got smaller products. But I think, for example, like an ingredient list, like I know for a lot of like sustainability focused consumers, like what they look for is a really small ingredient list. So that in itself can basically like tell you no lies. Like, it's not down to the marketing, it's kind of down to just what's in the product. If there's a small number of ingredients, that means that the product is more likely to be sustainable. And then obviously just not being so like overt with it. I think sometimes, you know, for brands, even if they're sustainable, you know, they're pushing that language, and it can be very easy to almost like step over the line and say something that might not be quite true. So I think it's always about scaling back some of that language and making it very, very clear that this is exactly what we mean. This is where we substantiate that claim. That's a really great call out, both Jill and Sophia. I think that it's such a good thing for brands to remember to, you know, really just bring it back to talking specifically about your product, what your product does, and how it is, you know, become more eco-friendly, or it has become, you know, better for the planet, or the specific changes that you're making, or the specific thing that you're focused on. I think that's a really good call out here. One of the ones I have to share that just drives me crazy is when I see biodegradable on things, because I mean, like, yeah, technically everything will degrade eventually, but biodegradability is so nuanced, and there's only so much that you can do unless you are sending something to a commercial biodegrading facility, or you have, you know, you're composting in your backyard with, like, you know, all of the bells and whistles, then of course it's biodegradable. But otherwise, you know, most people are not getting those products into the right places. Oh my God, that was exactly the one that I was going to call out. I just realized, yeah, biodegradable is one I hate. And by the way, there is one thing that doesn't biodegrade, and that's plastic. But in terms of everything else, yeah, you have to have such specific conditions for something to biodegrade properly. And most of the time that does require like an industrial waste facility, very specific like heat and temperature conditions, like moisture. So most of the times when you're talking about a product and seeing, like, you know, just a slapped on biodegradable label is probably not something that you can actually biodegrade at home. It means that it still needs to be sent off somewhere and biodegraded in a very specific way, where not everyone has those facilities anyway at their local like waste recycling plant. Yeah, 100%. I also want to touch really briefly on packaging. And also, if anyone listening has any questions or comments or anything they want to share, please raise your hand. We have a few more minutes here. But I also want to sort of call out a little bit of information that I've received in some of my reporting. And it's that, you know, just to remember that everything has nuance. Refillable packaging isn't necessarily better for the planet than single use. Plastic is not always worse for the planet than aluminum or glass. There really is sort of nuance in everything, and these sort of like black and white marketing ideas, I think, sometimes will get a brand in trouble. I think that's something to really remember. And then one more thing, going back to the EU, that I think the EU greenwashing ban, I think, is really interesting. And Sophia, tell me what you think about this. I know that marketing materials will be under scrutiny, of course, like, you know, anything on an advertisement or on social media, but also climate reports, which I know we see a lot of brands releasing climate reports. And I never would have thought that they would be held to such scrutiny as, you know, an ad, but that is what's happening. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think sometimes like it's always a question of like how you interpret data. Like I think there's some very interesting stats around the fact that, you know, you can see one graph and it points all the way down, and then if you put it in a slightly different configuration, it actually, the data shows that the curved graph is going all the way up. So I think it's almost the same thing. You have to make sure that you're very accurate in terms of what data you're putting forward in those reports, the kind of language that you're using around, you know, the data itself. So, you know, don't give yourself accolades if that's not actually something that's happened. You know, focus on real-time accomplishments in terms of like certifications. I think in the UK, some of the big ones are like the butterfly mark. That's one's kind of like a bigger one. And obviously you've got B Corp globally, which is also a really big one. So those are kind of the targets that brands should be aiming for in terms of those sustainability reports, because a lot of the times I think this is where the crackdown is really going to happen, is that self-reporting is almost going to have to go away, just because it's so easy to maybe not even intentionally, but like misrepresent the data, and then possibly not even like have it checked over properly. So I think doing that where it's, you know, not something that's checked by a third party like a B Corp is basically putting yourself in the firing line.
That's a really great call out. And I feel like maybe I didn't mention that well enough up at the top of this call, but, you know, I don't think that greenwashing is inherently, you know, devious or something that a brand is like, ooh, we're getting away with this. I think that a lot of it is just the science is changing, the goalpost is moving. We're in this new world where in 1970, when Earth Day started, there was no EPA. People weren't even really thinking about any of this. You know, it was very, it was wild. It was controversial. It was something crazy to be out, you know, saying, let's protect the planet. And that was only 50 years ago. So, of course, you know, things are going to continue to change. And hopefully this call was a little bit helpful for everyone listening to kind of have a slightly different POV on some of these big topics. If anyone has any last questions or comments, we're about to wrap up, but so glad that everyone was able to tune in and listen to this conversation about greenwashing.